The rain in Oak Ridge doesn't just fall, it soaks into your soul, heavy and cold, smelling of wet cedar and broken promises. I stood on the sidewalk of Miller Lane, my boots sinking into the mud, watching the only life I had ever known being tossed into a rusted metal dumpster like it was nothing but industrial waste. It was a Tuesday. My mother always said Tuesdays were for new beginnings, but as I watched a black plastic bag burst open, spilling my childhood diaries and my mother's hand-knitted sweaters into the filth, it felt like the end of the world. "Beatrice, stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking against the wind. "That's my mother's lace. That's the quilt she finished the night before she—" The front door of the Victorian house, the house my father built with his own 2 hands, swung open wider. Beatrice stepped out onto the wraparound porch, looking as polished and cold as a marble gravestone. She wasn't wearing morning clothes. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and pearls, the kind of outfit you wear to a victory celebration, not a week after your husband's funeral. "It's not lace anymore, Elena," she said, her voice carrying that sharp, melodic edge that used to fool my father into thinking she was elegant. "It's clutter. And this house? It's a clean slate now. Your father is gone, and frankly, so is your lease on my patience." She didn't even look at me when she signaled the 2 hired movers. They picked up a wooden crate, the one my father kept in his study, filled with blueprints and old family photographs, and tilted it over the edge of the dumpster. I lunged forward, trying to catch a flying photograph of my parents on their wedding day, but my foot slipped in the mud. I fell hard, the cold water seeping into my jeans, watching the wind catch the photo and drag it into the muck. "You can't do this," I whispered, the rain mixing with the tears I refused to let her see. "Dad promised. He said the house would always be a home for me." Beatrice laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was worse. It was a patient, pitying sound, the kind you give to someone who hasn't realized they've already lost the game. "Richard said a lot of things when he was sick, sweetheart. But the law speaks in ink, not whispers. And the ink says this house is mine. Every brick, every floorboard, and every piece of trash you left lying around in it." She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the empty street like a gavel coming down. I sat there in the dirt, surrounded by the remnants of 18 years of memories, watching the dumpster fill up. My father had been dead for 6 days. My mother had been gone for 4 years. And in less than an hour, my stepmother had managed to erase every trace that the 3 of us had ever existed under that roof. I reached out and pulled a waterlogged teddy bear from the edge of a trash bag. Its glass eye was missing, and it smelled of the basement, but I held it to my chest as if it could still protect me. Beatrice thought she had won. She thought that by throwing my belongings in the trash, she was throwing me away. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that while she was busy redecorating the master bedroom, I had spent the night at the Pinecrest Motel, staring at a manila folder I'd found hidden in my mother's old sewing machine. A folder that contained a secret even my father hadn't been strong enough to tell her. I stood up, wiped the mud from my face, and looked up at the window of my old bedroom. Beatrice was standing there watching me, a glass of wine in her hand. She thought she was the queen of the castle. But the rain was starting to let up, and for the first time in a week, the air smelled like something else. Not just wet earth and trash. It smelled like justice. "My name is Elena, and that girl you just saw standing in the mud, that was me 3 months ago. I was 22 years old, grieving, and completely convinced that I had lost everything. I was holding a soggy teddy bear and watching my stepmother erase my existence with a smirk on her face. But as they say, the truth has a funny way of surfacing, especially when someone tries so hard to bury it under a pile of trash. What Beatrice didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have grasped in her greed, was that my mother was a woman who saw the storm clouds years before the first drop of rain ever fell. My mother, Sarah, didn't just build a life, she built a legacy, and she had prepared a fortress that no amount of malice could tear down. She knew the heart of the man she married, and she knew the kind of person who would eventually try to fill her shoes. Before I take you through the twists and turns of how I reclaimed my home and my dignity, I'd like to invite you into this community. If this story, or any story of standing your ground against the odds, resonates with you, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it's a powerful one. It ensures that these stories of truth and triumph reach the people who need to hear them most, reminding them that they aren't alone. Also, I'm genuinely curious about who is on the other side of this screen right now. Please drop a comment below letting me know your location and the local time where you are. I spend my evenings reading through your responses, and it reminds me that no matter how isolated I felt on that rainy Tuesday on Miller Lane, I am part of something much bigger now. Now, let's leave the rain for a moment. Let's go back 16 years, to a time when the sun always seemed to hit the porch just right, and the air smelled like something worth keeping. To understand why I was sitting in the rain, clutching a muddy bear and staring at a dumpster, you have to understand what that house on Miller Lane used to be. It wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was a living, breathing history of my mother's soul and my father's sweat. My father, Robert, was a man who believed that a person's word was as solid as a foundation. In Oak Ridge, he was known as the man who built things to last. He wasn't one of those developers who threw up cardboard walls and called it a luxury condo. No, Dad built homes for families who wanted to plant roots. He spent his Saturdays helping neighbors fix leaky roofs and his Sundays sitting on our wraparound porch, drinking coffee and staring at the mountains with a look of pure contentment. He built our house with his own hands the summer my mother found out she was pregnant with me. Every nail, every beam, every window frame was set with the intention of keeping us safe. But if Dad was the bones of that house, my mother, Sarah, was its heartbeat. Sarah was a woman who lived in color. She was a middle school art teacher, the kind who came home with paint under her fingernails and a smile that could melt the winter frost. She had this ritual. Every spring, she would plant rows of lavender in the backyard. She said the scent of lavender was the smell of peace, and by mid-July, our entire property would hum with bees and smell like a dream. The kitchen always smelled like lemon polish and whatever she was baking. On rainy days like the one I was currently sitting in, she would make cinnamon rolls, and the heat from the oven would fog up the windows, making the world outside disappear. I remember my childhood as a blur of lavender fields and the sound of Dad's hammer in the garage. I was the center of their universe. Mom taught me that silence wasn't something to be afraid of. It was a space to think. She taught me how to sketch the way the light hit the oak trees and how to listen to the house when it settled at night. "It's just the house breathing, Elena," she'd say, tucking me in. "It's making sure we're still here." Everything changed on a Thursday in April 4 years ago. It's funny how life-altering news always arrives on a mundane weekday. Mom had been feeling tired, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. We thought it was just a late-season flu, but when the doctor sat us down in that sterile office, his face was too still. Stage 4, lung cancer. She had never smoked a day in her life, but the doctor just shrugged and said, "Sometimes the cells just make a mistake." The next 2 years were a slow, agonizing theft. I watched the woman who lived in color turn into a grayscale version of herself. The paint under her nails was replaced by hospital ID bands. The smell of lavender in her hair was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of antiseptic. Dad stayed strong for her, but I could see the light going out in his eyes. He stopped building things. His tools gathered dust in the garage, and the house started to feel cold, even in the summer. Toward the end, when her fingers had become so thin they looked like bird wings, she pulled me close. It was 3 days before she passed. The sun was hitting the hospital bed in a way that made her skin look almost translucent. "Elena," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Listen to me. This house, Miller Lane, it's yours. It doesn't matter whose name is on the mailbox or who sits in the kitchen. That house belongs to the memories we made inside it, what your father built for us. It can't be bought or sold. Promise me you won't let anyone erase us." I didn't understand then what she was really saying. I thought she was just being sentimental. I promised her, of course, through my tears. I promised I would take care of Dad and keep the lavender alive. I thought that was enough. When she died, the silence that followed was deafening. The piano she used to play stood in the parlor like a ghost. Dad was a shell of a man. He moved through the house like a stranger, touching the walls as if he were trying to remember who lived there. He was vulnerable, grieving, and completely unmoored. And that was when the weather in Oak Ridge began to shift. A year and a half after the funeral, Beatrice entered the picture. She appeared at a town fundraiser, looking like a breath of fresh air to a man who had been suffocating in grief. She was polished, charming, and seemed so eager to help Dad move forward. The neighbors told Dad he deserved to be happy again. They told him he was too young to be a widower forever. I tried to be happy for him. I really did. I wanted to see him smile again. But every time Beatrice walked into our kitchen, she seemed to take up more space than my mother ever had. She started talking about modernizing the house and clearing out the clutter. She looked at my mother's lavender garden with a frown, complaining about her allergies. Dad was so desperate for companionship that he didn't see the edges on her. He didn't see the way she looked at the mahogany floors and the antique furniture, not with appreciation, but with a calculator in her eyes. He was a man who built things to last, but he hadn't realized that the person he was letting in was a demolition crew in a silk blouse. By the time they got married, the foundation of our life had already started to crack. I didn't know it then, but the clean slate Beatrice was dreaming of didn't include me, and it certainly didn't include the legacy my mother had literally died to protect. I was 20 years old, a college student trying to navigate a world without a mother, and I was too blind to see that the woman calling herself my stepmother was already planning my eviction from the only home I'd ever known. Looking back at that house from the rain, I realized that my mother hadn't just been giving me a sentimental blessing on her deathbed. She had been giving me a warning. She knew my father's heart. She knew he was a builder, not a fighter. She knew he would choose the path of least resistance because he couldn't bear to lose another person. And she had made her own plans. Plans that were currently hidden in a motel room inside a manila folder that Beatrice didn't know existed. Plans that were about to turn her clean slate into a legal nightmare. They say that grief is a vacuum, and if you don't fill it with something good, it will pull in whatever is closest. For my father, that whatever was Beatrice. She didn't just walk into our lives, she orchestrated an entry. It started with a casserole at a town fundraiser and ended with a moving truck parked in our driveway on Miller Lane. At first, she was the perfect antidote to the heavy, lavender-scented silence my mother had left behind. She was bright, loud in a way that felt energetic rather than intrusive, and she looked at my father as if he were a hero who had just returned from a long, weary war. Dad, who had been drifting in a fog of what-ifs and if-onlys, grabbed onto her like a drowning man reaches for a life raft. The wedding was small, just a courthouse ceremony followed by a lunch at a nearby bistro. I remember sitting there, staring at my father's hand as he held hers. He was wearing his best suit, the one he wore to my mother's funeral, and for a second, the irony felt like a physical weight in my chest. Beatrice was wearing a pale pink dress, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, smiling at everyone as if she had lived in Oak Ridge her entire life. She was a woman who knew how to occupy a room. The shift happened the very first weekend she moved in. It was subtle, like the way the tide pulls the sand out from under your feet before you even realize you're sinking. Beatrice arrived with more than just suitcases. She arrived with a vision, and that vision didn't have much room for the way things used to be. "Elena, honey," she said to me that Saturday morning, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness that I would soon learn to dread. I was looking at the hallway. It's a bit dark, isn't it? All this heavy wood and these old-fashioned frames. We need to breathe some life into this place, don't you think? Before I could answer, she was already unhooking a framed photograph of my mother in the garden. "We'll find a much better place for this," she chirped, setting the frame face down on the console table. By Sunday, the boxes arrived, and so did the children. Leo was 14, a boy who seemed to carry a permanent cloud of boredom and entitlement around him. Maya was 12, already mimicking her mother's sharp glances and dismissive sighs. They didn't come in as guests. They came in as conquerors. They ran up the stairs, their heavy boots thumping on the mahogany floors my father had polished every month. "I want the room with the big window," Leo shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway where my mother's piano used to hum. "Leo, that's Elena's room," my father said, though his voice lacked the authority it used to have. He looked at Beatrice, seeking approval. Beatrice didn't even blink. She walked over to Dad, smoothed his lapel, and leaned in close. "Robert, darling, Leo is a growing boy. He needs the desk space for his studies. Elena is so organized, I'm sure she wouldn't mind moving to the guest room down the hall. It's more private for a girl her age anyway. It's about making the house work for everyone, right?" I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say no. Waiting for him to remember that he had built that room specifically for me, with the built-in bookshelves for my sketches and the window seat where Mom used to read to me. But Dad didn't look at me. He looked at Beatrice's smiling face and the way she made everything sound so logical. "Maybe she's right, Elena," he murmured. "It's just a room. We're a family now. We have to make sacrifices." That was the first time I heard that word. Sacrifices. In Beatrice's vocabulary, sacrifice was a one-way street, and I was the only one traveling on it. Within a month, the modernization was in full swing. My mother's lace curtains were replaced by gray linen panels that blocked out the morning sun. The warm, yellow walls were painted a cold, sterile white. Every time I walked through the front door, the house felt less like a home and more like a high-end furniture showroom. The most painful part wasn't the paint or the furniture. It was the silence. Not the peaceful silence my mother taught me to love, but a forced, tense silence. I stopped talking at the dinner table because every time I shared a memory of Mom or Dad's old stories, Beatrice would skillfully pivot the conversation to Leo's soccer practice or Maya's dance lessons. "That was a long time ago, Elena," she'd say with a thin smile. "We're living in the present now. Isn't that right, Robert?" And Dad would nod. He was there, but he wasn't there. He was like a ghost in his own house, following Beatrice's lead, laughing at her jokes, and slowly, brick by brick, allowing her to wall me out of his life. I was becoming a ghost too, a shadow moving through a house that was being rewritten to exclude me. I started spending more time in the garage, sitting among the tools Dad no longer used, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and old dreams. I didn't realize it then, but Beatrice wasn't just redecorating. She was erasing the foundation. She was preparing the ground for the day she would finally decide that I was the last piece of clutter that needed to be thrown away. They say you don't need a weapon to kill someone. Sometimes you just take away their space until they cease to exist. In Oak Ridge, as the first frost of winter began to bite, that's exactly what was happening to me. I was becoming a shadow in my own home, a ghost haunting a house that was being systematically scrubbed of my mother's soul and my own history. The day Beatrice ordered me to vacate my bedroom was the day I realized my feelings no longer carried any weight on Miller Lane. I spent that Saturday packing 18 years of life into cardboard boxes. Every childhood trophy, every sketchbook, and every dried flower from my mother's garden felt like a heavy anchor as I taped the boxes shut. Closing each lid felt like I was shoveling dirt onto my mother's memory for the last time. "The basement isn't so bad, Elena," Beatrice said, leaning against the doorframe of Leo's, new room. She was holding a color palette of modern grays and cool whites. "It'll give you that privacy you teenagers are always brooding about. It's a win-win, really." Her voice had that synthetic sweetness, the kind used to mask the taste of poison. The basement was a cold, unfinished storage space at the end of a steep flight of stairs. It smelled of damp concrete and forgotten things. The only light came from a single buzzing bulb hanging from a spiderweb-covered rafter. The floor was freezing, a physical manifestation of the reception I was now getting on the main floor. Above me, I could hear the thumping of Leo's boots as he claimed my old room, the room where my mother used to sing me to sleep, now echoing with the sounds of his heavy footsteps and blaring video games. Life settled into a chilling pattern. Beatrice didn't just take the rooms, she took my father's mind. Robert, the man who used to be my hero, began to shrink. He stopped making eye contact with me. At the dinner table, he would only laugh at Beatrice's jokes or ask about Maya's dance lessons. I was relegated to the chair at the far end, right next to the drafty kitchen door, a place where I could observe their new family portrait, but never be part of it. "Dad, can we go for that hike at Black Bear Ridge tomorrow? Like we used to?" I asked one morning, trying to find a crack in the wall they had built around him. Dad started to nod, his eyes almost brightening, but then Beatrice's manicured hand landed on his shoulder. "Oh, Robert, did you forget? We're taking Leo to the city for his new soccer kit. Elena, you understand, don't you? Growing boys need their gear. Family first." Dad just looked back at his coffee and mumbled, "Maybe next week, sweetheart." But next week never came. I watched as my father chose the path of least resistance, trading my happiness for the temporary peace Beatrice offered him. The modernization of the house was relentless. One afternoon, I returned from my college classes to find a landscaping crew in the backyard. My heart stopped. They were digging up my mother's lavender garden. The rows of purple and silver green that Mom had nurtured with her own hands were being tossed into a heap of dirt like common weeds. "I have allergies, Elena," Beatrice said, watching from the porch with a glass of iced tea. And honestly, that garden was a mess. It didn't fit the clean lines I want for the patio. We're putting in a paved fire pit area. It'll be much more functional for entertaining. I stood there, my throat tight, watching the only living thing left of my mother being ripped out by its roots. Each strike of the shovel felt like a blow to my chest. Every clump of lavender tossed aside was a memory being erased. I went down to my basement room and sat on the cold floor, the smell of damp concrete mocking the ghost of the lavender scent I tried so hard to remember. Above me, the house creaked and groaned as it was rewritten to exclude me. Beatrice's plan was simple but devastating, make me feel so invisible that I would eventually choose to disappear. She threw a housewarming party for the neighbors to show off the renovations. She didn't invite a single one of my friends. When I confronted her, she tilted her head with that practiced look of confusion. "Oh, honey, I didn't think you'd want to be around boring adults. I assumed you'd be busy with your school things." That night, I stood in the shadows of the hallway and watched people I had known my whole life laughing and drinking wine on the new patio, the patio that sat on top of my mother's destroyed garden. They were admiring the clean lines and the modern feel, completely unaware that they were standing on a graveyard of memories. I realized then that Beatrice hadn't just moved in, she had staged a coup. I began to pack a small suitcase. 18 years of identity shouldn't fit into a 26-inch nylon bag, but when your history is being thrown in the trash, you learn what truly matters. I wrote a note to my father, leaving it on his pillow where I knew Beatrice wouldn't see it until it was too late. "Dad, I love you, but I can't stay in a house where I'm treated like a guest who stayed too long. I'm going to make my own way." I took the 5 a.m. bus to Seattle, the cold fog of the cedar forests wrapping around the station like a shroud. I spent years building a life in the city, becoming a successful real estate agent, and learning the language of deeds and titles. I told myself I didn't need Miller Lane, but every time I saw a house with a wraparound porch or smelled a hint of lavender in a flower shop, the ache returned. For 16 years, I let the silence win. I didn't know that back in Oak Ridge, the house was dying under Beatrice's modernization. And I didn't know that my father, in his final months, had finally woken up. He had seen the way Beatrice's children treated him once he was too sick to be useful. He realized that by erasing my mother and me, he had erased the only people who ever truly loved him. But Richard Townsend was a builder, and even as his heart was failing, he decided to build one last thing: a trap. He made a phone call that Beatrice never intercepted. He called the one person who knew the truth about how that house was originally deeded. I didn't go back for the funeral because Beatrice blocked my number, but I went back for the house. Because the folder I carried from Seattle, the one I'd found hidden in my mother's old sewing machine years ago, contained a truth that no amount of gray paint could cover up. Beatrice thought she had thrown my life in the trash, but she was about to find out that she was the one who didn't belong on Miller Lane. 16 years is a long time to build a life, but it's an even longer time to lose a father, one missed phone call and one filtered conversation at a time. In Seattle, I had become Elena the real estate broker, sharp, independent, and shielded by a professional exterior. But every month when I dialed the landline of the house on Miller Lane, I became that little girl in the basement again, reaching for a connection that was slowly being severed. The calls followed a predictable, agonizing script. At first, they lasted 20 minutes. We talked about my classes, the rain in Seattle, and Dad's projects in the garage. Then they shrank to 10 minutes, then 5. Beatrice was always there, a persistent hum in the background, coughing or asking Dad where he'd put the remote. Subtle reminders that she was the gatekeeper of his time. "Richard, dear, the tea is getting cold," I'd hear her say. Or, "Richard, you shouldn't overexert yourself with long stories." Dad's voice, once as deep and resonant as the mahogany beams he loved, began to thin. It sounded like a radio station losing its signal as you drive further into the mountains. I sent letters, birthday cards, and photos of my first office closing, but the replies were short and shaky. "Proud of you, sweetheart." I knew Beatrice was the one handing him the pen. I knew she was the one watching him write every letter. Then came the news that the builder of Oak Ridge was failing. Heart failure, complicated by a lifetime of inhaling sawdust and the heavy, stagnant grief he had never truly processed. I called Beatrice, my voice trembling. "I'm coming home. I need to see him." "Elena, darling, he's so fragile right now," she cooed, though the coldness underneath was unmistakable. "The doctor says visitors agitate him. It's for his own good, really. I'll tell him you called." I called again a month later. He's sleeping. I called his cell phone directly. It went to voicemail every single time. I didn't know it then, but my father was being held captive by care. Beatrice had created a fortress of sterile comfort, surrounding him with her own children, while making sure his biological daughter remained a distant, fading memory. The end didn't come with a long goodbye or a final reconciliation. It came with a short administrative phone call on a Wednesday morning in March. "Your father passed this morning," Beatrice said. She didn't sound like a grieving widow. She sounded like a woman canceling a dentist appointment. "The funeral is Saturday. It's a small, private family gathering. I'm sure you understand." She hung up before I could even draw a breath to scream. I drove 3.5 hours from Seattle to Oak Ridge in a state of hollowed-out fury. The mountains looked the same, the cedar trees still stood tall, but the world felt fundamentally broken. I arrived at the white, steepled church on the hill 10 minutes before the service. I was wearing the only black dress I owned, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I walked into the church, the smell of floor wax and lilies hitting me like a physical blow. I looked for the family pew, expecting to find a place reserved for the only child of the man in the navy blue suit lying in the casket. But the front row was already occupied. Beatrice sat in the center, draped in expensive pearls my mother never wore because she said they felt like a chokehold. To her left was Leo, looking bored in a sports coat, and to her right was Maya, staring blankly at her hands. There was no space for me. A silver-haired usher, a man who had known my father for 30 years, looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. He pointed toward the back. "Guest seating is in the rear, miss." I walked toward the casket anyway. I had to see him. I had to say the things I hadn't been allowed to say over the phone. Dad looked peaceful, his hands folded, looking just like he did when he used to nap on the porch after mowing the lawn. I reached out to touch his hand, to feel the skin of the man who built my world. Suddenly, Leo stepped in front of me. He had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face that held all of Beatrice's arrogance. "Mom said, family only at the casket right now," he whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You understand, right?" I stood there, my hand frozen in midair, while 12 rows of Oak Ridge residents watched. People who had seen me grow up, people who had bought houses from my father, sat in silence. No one stood up. No one told Leo to move. Beatrice didn't even look back. She just adjusted her veil, her back a wall of polished silk. I turned and walked to the very last pew. I said goodbye to my father from 20 feet away, exactly the distance Beatrice had been building between us for 16 years. As the service ended and I stood in the parking lot, gasping for the cold mountain air, I saw a woman I didn't recognize sitting on a bench near the side entrance. She was in her late 50s, wearing a hospital lanyard. She looked at me and nodded, a sharp, knowing nod that suggested the story didn't end with a funeral. But the real blow came that evening. I received an email from Beatrice's attorney, Frank Garrett. The subject line was cold and final, will reading notification. Attendance is strictly limited to individuals named as beneficiaries in the decedent's last will and testament, the email read. My name was not on the list. Beatrice had done it. She had erased my mother. She had erased the lavender, and now she was erasing me from my father's legacy. She thought she had closed the door and locked it. What she didn't know was that while she was playing the grieving widow, the woman with the hospital lanyard had already made a delivery to a motel room on Route 9, a delivery that contained a voice Beatrice thought she had silenced forever. The lock didn't turn. I stood on the porch of the house on Miller Lane, the heavy iron key, the one I'd carried since I was 10 years old, biting into my palm. I tried again, twisting it until my wrist ached, but the mechanism remained stubborn and cold. It wasn't stuck. It had been replaced. I hammered on the oak door, the sound echoing through the quiet, rain-heavy afternoon of Oak Ridge. "Beatrice, open the door. It's Elena." A full minute passed before the deadbolt slid back with a sharp metallic click. The door opened just a few inches, held by a security chain I didn't recognize. Beatrice stood there, her hair perfectly styled in a sleek bob, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly rent in Seattle. She looked at me not as a stepdaughter, but as a persistent solicitor she was about to report to the police. "Elena," she said, her voice flat. "The funeral ended hours ago. I assumed you'd be halfway back to your little apartment by now. I came to get my things, Beatrice. And to talk about Dad's affairs. The lawyer said you weren't an heir," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Which means anything inside this house is now part of my private estate. I've already spent the afternoon making arrangements. This house is far too large for a grieving widow, and frankly, it's full of unnecessary weight." "Weight?" I whispered. "You mean our lives? My mother's things?" Beatrice smiled, that thin, shark-like smile that never reached her eyes. "I mean clutter, dear. I've hired a crew. They'll be here shortly to help me edit the inventory. You should have taken your trinkets when you ran away 16 years ago. Now, they're just obstacles to a clean sale." She closed the door before I could scream. Sale? She was selling the house? The house my father built with his own sweat? The house where the lavender was supposed to grow forever? I didn't leave. I sat in my rental car at the end of the driveway, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 20 minutes later, a massive, rusted orange dumpster was backed into the driveway by a growling truck. Following it was a white van with quick clear transitions plastered on the side. 2 men in heavy work boots stepped out. Beatrice met them on the porch, pointing toward the basement entrance. My entrance. I jumped out of the car, the rain starting to mist the air. "Stop! You can't go in there!" The men looked at Beatrice. She waved a dismissive hand. "She's just emotional. Please, start with the basement and the attic. If it's not modern, it goes in the bin." I watched in horror as the editing began. First, it was the old trunk from the attic, the one that held my father's high school yearbooks and my mother's collection of vintage art magazines. One of the movers hauled it to the edge of the dumpster and simply tilted it. The sound of shifting paper and heavy wood hitting the metal bottom sounded like a gunshot. Beatrice, stop this. I ran toward the dumpster, reaching in to grab whatever I could. I pulled out a bundle of my father's blueprints, hand-drawn designs of homes he'd built all over the county. They were damp, the blue ink starting to bleed into the gray paper. "Those are his life's work," I shouted, looking up at her on the porch. "They are outdated relics of a man who didn't know how to move on," she replied, sipping from a porcelain cup. "Just like you, Elena. You're a relic. You think you have a right to this place because you shared a bloodline? The law cares about titles, not memories." Then came the bags. Black, heavy-duty plastic bags. One of them burst as it hit the rim of the dumpster. Out tumbled a heap of white lace. My breath hitched. It was the tablecloth my mother had spent 3 years crocheting. It was supposed to be for my wedding day. It was stained now, smeared with the grease and rust from the dumpster's interior. I dived toward it, my hands scraping against the jagged metal. "Please," I sobbed, the rain now coming down in earnest, soaking through my thin jacket. "Just let me take the personal items. You don't want these. They have no value to you." "That's where you're wrong," Beatrice said, walking down the steps, her heels clicking rhythmically on the stone. "Their value is in their absence. As long as this house smells like your mother and looks like your father, it's a museum. I'm not a curator, Elena. I'm a businesswoman, and this property is my retirement fund." She looked at the movers. "The piano in the parlor. It's out of tune and takes up too much floor space. Get it out." "No, not the piano. That piano was the soul of the house. My mother's fingers had danced over those keys every Tuesday and Thursday. The notes were literally embedded in the walls." I tried to block the porch steps, but Leo, who had appeared from inside the house, grabbed my shoulders and shoved me aside. He was grinning, enjoying the spectacle of my undoing. "Listen to Mom, Elena," he sneered. "You're trespassing. If you don't get off the property, we're calling the sheriff. And believe me, the sheriff and my mom are on very good terms." I stood there in the mud, the rain turning the driveway into a slick, gray mess. I watched my childhood being dismantled piece by piece. The movers came out with my father's heavy oak desk. They didn't even try to be careful. They let it crash onto the driveway, the legs splintering. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. Beatrice thought she was cleaning a house. She thought she was throwing away trash. She was so blinded by her greed, so convinced of her victory, that she had forgotten one thing about my father. He was a builder who always included a fail-safe in his designs. I reached into my pocket and touched the manila folder I'd retrieved from the Pinecrest Motel earlier, the one the nurse Helen had told me about. Inside was a copy of a deed that hadn't been touched in 30 years. A deed that my mother had made my father sign long before Beatrice ever cast her shadow on Miller Lane. I looked at Beatrice one last time. She was watching a mover toss my old teddy bear into the heap. I didn't scream anymore. I didn't beg. "You're right about one thing, Beatrice," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to carry through the rain. "The law speaks in ink, and I think it's time you learned what the ink actually says about who owns this dirt." I turned and walked toward my car. I had one more stop to make before the real estate agent arrived for Beatrice's clean sale. The next morning, the rain had retreated, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. I didn't go back to the motel. I sat in my car outside the Miller Lane property, watching. At exactly 10 a.m., a sleek charcoal gray SUV pulled into the driveway, dodging the mud puddles with practiced ease. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a granite block, Marcus Thorne. In the world of Washington real estate, Marcus Thorne was the man you called when you wanted to move $1 million property fast and quiet. He didn't just sell houses, he curated transitions. Beatrice had chosen him because his name carried authority, the kind of authority she needed to validate her theft. I watched from the curb as Beatrice opened the door. She was back in her element, wearing a tailored navy suit, her face a mask of professional grief and entrepreneurial ambition. She shook Marcus's hand, gesturing inside with a flourish that made my stomach churn. She was selling my mother's soul as a turnkey investment opportunity. I stepped out of my car. My boots were still stained with yesterday's mud, and my jacket was damp, but I walked up that driveway with a folder tucked under my arm like it was a shield. "Mr. Thorne?" I called out just as they were about to step inside. Marcus turned. He had sharp, observant eyes, the kind of eyes that notice a foundation crack from 50 yards away. Beatrice's smile didn't just falter, it vanished. "Elena," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "I told you yesterday. The sheriff is one phone call away. This is a private business meeting." "It is a business meeting," I said, ignoring her and looking directly at Marcus. "And as a fellow professional in the industry, I'm a broker in Seattle. I thought you might appreciate a bit of due diligence before you put your name on this listing." Marcus Thorne paused, his hand on the doorframe. He looked at Beatrice, then back at me. "Due diligence?" Mrs. Townsend told me the title was clear. A simple spousal transfer following the husband's passing. "A simple transfer usually requires a clean title, Mr. Thorne," I said, stepping onto the porch. I felt Beatrice move toward me, her hand raised as if to shove me back, but Marcus stepped between us. "Wait," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Townsend, who is this? She's a troubled relative," Beatrice spat, her composure cracking. "She's been estranged for 16 years and is trying to contest the will. My lawyer, Frank Garrett, has already confirmed her status. She is a non-entity in this estate." I opened the manila folder. I didn't hand him the whole thing, not yet. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a copy of a deed dated 32 years ago, the year the house was completed. Mr. Thorne, my father, Robert Townsend, was a builder. He knew better than anyone that the most important part of a house isn't the paint, it's the ground it sits on. My mother, Sarah, was the one who provided the capital for this land. It was her family's inheritance. I pointed to a specific clause at the bottom of the deed. This isn't a standard joint tenancy. This is a life estate with a remainder interest. My father had the right to live here until he died. Yes. But the title? The title was placed in a family trust the moment I was born. Beatrice laughed, a shrill, desperate sound. "That's ancient history." Robert updated everything. "I have the new deed. I have the signed transfer from 3 years ago." Marcus took the paper from my hand. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his pocket and studied it. The silence on the porch was so thick, you could hear the drip of rainwater from the eaves. "This deed," Marcus whispered, his brow furrowing. "If this is the original filing—" "Mrs. Townsend, the transfer you showed me yesterday, was that signed by Richard alone?" "Of course," Beatrice snapped. "He was the owner." "No," I said, stepping closer. "He was a trustee, and according to the Townsend Family Trust, the one my mother established, a trustee cannot transfer or sell the primary residence without the written consent of the remainder man. Me." Beatrice's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled red. "You're lying. That's a fake." "Frank Garrett checked the records." "Frank Garrett checked the records you gave him, Beatrice," I countered. "He didn't go to the county archives in Bridgewater. He didn't look at the physical books from the 80s because you told him there was no need. You showed him a restated title that you had my father sign when he was on high doses of beta blockers and morphine." Marcus Thorne looked at Beatrice. The professional respect he'd shown her minutes ago was evaporating. "Mrs. Townsend, is there a trust associated with this property that you didn't disclose to my office?" "There is no trust," she shrieked. "Robert told me everything. He said he wanted me to have the house. He wanted Leo and Maya to have a future. What Robert wanted in his final medicated months doesn't override what Sarah did when she was alive," I said. I pulled out the second document, an affidavit from the nurse, Helen Briggs, and a cognitive evaluation from Dr. Feldman. "Mr. Thorne, this is proof that any document my father signed in the last 2 years was executed under medical impairment." But more importantly, I pulled out the final piece, the crown jewel. This is the revocation of the spousal power of attorney, signed by my father 14 months ago in the presence of Margaret Calloway. I looked at Beatrice, whose hand was now trembling so violently she had to grip her pearls. He woke up, Beatrice. He realized what you were doing. He couldn't tell you because he was afraid of you. He was afraid you'd stop his care or kick him out of the house he built. So he did the only thing a builder knows how to do. He reinforced the walls. Marcus Thorne handed the papers back to me. He stepped off the porch and stood on the driveway, looking up at the house. He wasn't seeing a $1 million listing anymore. He was seeing a legal minefield. "Mrs. Townsend," Marcus said, his voice cold and professional, "I'm afraid I cannot proceed with this listing. In fact, I'm going to have to report this discrepancy to the regional board. If you attempted to sell a property while knowingly concealing a trust interest, that's not just a civil matter. That's fraud." "Fraud?" Beatrice whispered, her voice finally losing its edge. No, I'm the widow. I'm the one who stayed. You're the one who threw her belongings in the trash," Marcus said, glancing at the dumpster that was still sitting in the driveway. "And from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who needs to start packing." He turned to me and gave a short, respectful nod. "Miss Townsend, your mother was very thorough. If I were you, I'd call the sheriff now. Not to report a trespasser, but to oversee an eviction." He got into his SUV and drove away, leaving a splashing trail of mud behind him. Beatrice stood on the porch of the house she thought she'd won, looking at me. For the first time in 16 years, the power dynamic had flipped. I wasn't the girl in the basement anymore. I was the owner of the ground she was standing on. The conference room at Garrett & Associates felt like a pressurized chamber. It was a room designed for quiet conversations and polite signatures, but today it smelled like cold coffee and impending ruin. Frank Garrett sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking at the ceiling as if he were trying to find a way out of the mess his client had created. Beatrice sat directly across from me, her fingers tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm on her designer handbag. Leo and Maya were behind her, leaning against the wall with their arms crossed, trying to maintain their masks of cool indifference. But even they could feel the shift in the air. The clean slate they had imagined was currently covered in the soot of their own greed. "I don't understand why we're even here, Frank," Beatrice said, her voice rising to that thin, jagged pitch I'd heard on the porch. "This girl is a trespasser. She's making up stories about trusts and deeds that don't exist. My husband's will was clear. The house is mine." Frank Garrett didn't look at her. He looked at the heavy, leather-bound folder I had placed on the table, the one Margaret Calloway, my mother's old attorney, had helped me finalize just hours ago. "Mrs. Townsend," Garrett said, his voice sounding tired. "It's not about the will anymore. It's about the title. And as it turns out, the title is complicated." I stood up. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like the daughter of Sarah and Robert Townsend, the daughter of a woman who planned for the storm and a man who, in the end, chose his child over his fear. "It's not complicated, Frank," I said, opening the folder. "It's actually very simple. Beatrice, you keep talking about what Dad gave you. But a person can only give what they actually own. And my father? He never owned the house on Miller Lane. Not entirely." I slid a document across the polished wood. It was the original deed of trust from 1994. "My mother, Sarah, purchased that land with her own inheritance," I explained, my voice steady and cold. "When the house was built, she insisted on a specific type of ownership. It's called a life estate with a remainder interest. She granted my father the right to live in that house for his entire life, a roof over his head until the day he died. But the ownership? The actual title?" I pointed to the notarized seal. The title was vested in the Townsend Family Irrevocable Trust, and according to the trust's bylaws, upon my father's death, the house doesn't pass to his spouse. It passes automatically and immediately to the remainder man. Me. Beatrice's hand went to her throat. "That's a lie. Robert told me. He said we were partners. He was a partner in the life you shared, I countered. But he was only a steward of the property. He had no legal authority to sell it, to mortgage it, or to leave it to you in a will. Any document you had him sign in the last 3 years, any transfer of deed or spousal gift, is legally null and void. He was signing away something that wasn't his to give. Frank Garrett picked up the document, his eyes scanning the fine print. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door. She's right, Beatrice. If this trust was never dissolved, and according to the county records Miss Townsend provided it wasn't, then your husband's will only covers his personal bank accounts and movable property. It doesn't touch the real estate. But I spent thousands redecorating, Beatrice shrieked, her performance of the grieving widow finally shattering. I ripped out that disgusting garden. I painted those walls. I'm the one who stayed with him while she was off in Seattle playing broker. You didn't stay with him, Beatrice, I said, leaning over the table. You patrolled him. You used his illness to isolate him. But you forgot who he was. My father was a builder. He knew how to hide a support beam where no one would look. He knew that one day I'd come looking for the truth. I pulled out the final piece of paper, the letter my father had hidden in his desk. Elena, the house was always your mother's gift to you. I was just the one holding the keys until you were strong enough to take them back. The silence in the room was absolute. Maya looked at the floor. Leo stared at the door. Beatrice looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. She had lost. The sale was dead. Marcus Thorne would never list the property, and the clean slate she wanted was now a legal record of her attempt to defraud a trust. You have until Sunday, I said, closing the folder. The dumpster you hired is still in the driveway. I suggest you use it to take your modern grays and your cool whites out of my mother's house, because on Monday morning the locks are being changed, and if any of you set foot on that porch again, I won't call the real estate agent. I'll call the police. I walked out of the office without waiting for a reply. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, for the first time in 16 years, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was going home. Monday morning didn't bring rain. It brought a crisp, golden sunrise that made the dew on the remaining grass on Miller Lane sparkle like diamonds. I stood on the sidewalk, watching as a white van pulled away. Not a moving truck this time, but a locksmith. The heavy oak doors now had new cylinders, and for the first time in 16 years, I held the only set of keys. Beatrice had left in the middle of the night. She didn't want the neighbors to see her packing her designer life into the same rusty dumpster she had used to discard my mother's memories. She left behind the sterile gray curtains and the cold white furniture, but she took her pride, which was now as tattered as the lace she'd thrown away. I walked inside and the house felt different. It didn't feel like a showroom anymore. I opened every window, letting the mountain air sweep out the scent of expensive perfume and stagnant lies. I spent the first few days stripping away the modernization. The gray panels came down, revealing the warm mahogany bones my father had built. I found the wedding photograph of my parents, the one I'd dived into the mud for, and I placed it back on the mantel. The crack in the glass was still there, a jagged line through their faces, but I decided not to fix it. It was a reminder that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. It just has to survive. The backyard was the hardest part. It was a graveyard of black dirt and tire tracks. But by Tuesday afternoon, a crew from the local nursery arrived. We spent hours planting fresh lavender starts, the same silver-green variety my mother had loved. As I pressed the soil around the roots, the smell hit me, not through my nose, but through my chest. It was the smell of peace. By next July, the bees would be back, and the house on Miller Lane would hum with life once more. I decided not to sell the house. Instead, I opened the front parlor, the room where my mother used to teach piano. I'm not a teacher, but a retired instructor from the high school reached out. Now, on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the sound of scales and simple melodies echoes through the hallway again. The house is breathing. It's a home for the community, a place where the history of Oak Ridge isn't just stored, but lived. Looking back, I realize my father wasn't the villain Beatrice tried to make him, nor the hero I wanted him to be. He was a man who got lost in his own grief. But in the dark, he found his way back to the light. He picked up a phone when he could barely speak. He signed a paper when he could barely hold a pen. He built one last thing, a future for me. My mother was right. A house isn't just walls and a roof. It's what you build inside it. And what we built was a fortress that no amount of trash bags could ever hold. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If Elena's story reminded you that it's never too late to fight for what belongs to you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories of truth, justice, and the power of family legacy. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you one last time. Have you ever had to reclaim something that was taken from you? Or have you ever set a boundary that changed your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Until next time, remember, the truth has a way of coming home.